This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is once again neurosurgeon Dr. Michael Egnor. And today we're going to talk about neuroscience and free will, and whether neuroscience, as many claim, proves that there is no free will. And so we'll discuss, for example, Sam Harris's arguments. Sam Harris, as many of you know, is probably the most popular proponent of the position that there is no free will, that we're determined. And so we're going to look at some of the philosophical problems, but Dr. Egnor argues that Harris incorrectly interprets the work of Benjamin Libet on the will and on the readiness potential, and that Libet himself did not reject free will. We also discuss some of the complex questions around consciousness and some of the materialist claims that consciousness can be reduced to physical neural processes. And here again, we examine the work of Bennett and Hacker on some of the conceptual errors that underlie much of cognitive neuroscience. We also discuss Wilder Penfield's work on epilepsy surgery and split brain patients, Ian McGilchrist a little bit on the two hemispheres of the brain, and Adrienne Allen's studies on brain activities in vegetative states, which is very, very interesting. I think this is an important episode for a number of reasons, but I think because it addresses neuroscience in relationship to fundamental questions of human freedom, of moral agency, the transcendent dignity of the person, and ultimately what it means to be a human person. So we hear a lot about how neuroscience proves that, well, we thought we had consciousness, or what we thought was free will or love or faith. It's really just complex neural processes. But with closer examination, we find not only are there real philosophical problems with these claims, there are also some problems with the neuroscience itself. And one of just kind of limiting the question. So as Ian McGilchrist writes in The Master and His Emissary, he argues that it's really a mistake to reduce the person simply to cognitive awareness. He said, why shouldn't we not be our unconscious as well as our conscious selves? So these experiences, they don't necessarily tell us that we don't have will. He writes, it just tells us we have to widen our concept of who we are to include our unconscious selves. So in my first conversation with Dr. Egnor, we discussed the general problem of preconceived materialism and the mereological fallacy. So that's the error of attributing the whole to the part. So it's the idea that the brain thinks, the brain decides, the brain feels, right? And that's an error. So today, we're going to continue with this, but we're going to focus on the question of free will, of consciousness, and some other interesting developments in neuroscience and philosophy. So thank you again for listening, and thanks especially to those who have written reviews. I've gotten some nice reviews lately and also some nice notes from some of you. So I'm happy you're finding the podcast worthwhile. Don't hesitate to let me know if you have any suggestions for topics or guests. And as always, if you like the podcast, please do write a review. It really does help grow the podcast, and please share with your family and your friends. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Michael Egnor on neuroscience and free will. So why don't we start here talking about free will, because I think that's a good place to start. I mean, one of the things you hear in neuroscience is that free will, it's been proved that free will doesn't exist. We're just operating with our brains. So Dr. Egnor, why don't you talk a little bit about the ideas of free will and maybe some of Benjamin Libet's studies?
Sure. Free will, I think, is among the more important questions that we face about the nature of consciousness and the nature of a human being, for a variety of reasons. If we deny free will, we essentially deny our humanity. That is, that we basically assert that we're just meat machines. So the free will is a really important concept. I think there are logical reasons why it makes no sense to deny free will. If you deny free will, what you're invariably saying is that everything that you do, every behavior you have, is a consequence of chemistry and physics going on in your body or in your brain. The problem is, of course, that propositions are not chemical and they're not physical. That is, a particular chemical reaction isn't a proposition that can be true or false. It's just a chemical reaction. So that if you say that you have no free will and that everything that is going on with you is just a result of your brain chemistry over which you exert no independent control, then that statement itself is not a proposition. It's just a secretion of sorts. It's just an activity of neurons. So why would one pay any attention to it? It's not even a proposition that can be true or false. So if you deny free will, what you're really saying is don't pay any attention to me because I'm just a bag of chemicals. So even logically, it doesn't make any sense to deny free will, because to hold an opinion that can correspond to the truth, you have to be more than a bag of chemicals.
Right. I think this is I've talked about this before on the show. I think this is one of the weaknesses of Sam Harris arguments. So now Sam Harris, maybe we'll talk about him a little bit because he is probably the most famous contemporary proponent of the idea that we don't have free will. And I think I've always thought when I listen to Harris, he has these long talks and books about how we don't have free will. And I find it first, on the logical sense, a bit amusing that he goes through a long argument and he says reason with us, trying to convince people that they don't have free will.
Right.
Well, if I don't have free will, I can't be convinced by a reasoned logical argument with propositions and a syllogism and conclusions to change my mind, because I'm determined to think there's free will.
Right.
And so I think there's a fundamental, like at the core of even the argument itself, even the attempt to argue against free will and to get me to be convinced of it, I think is an error. So I think there's deep philosophical problems there. But what I'd maybe like to talk about, and I agree with, I think, your point. It's exactly right. This is a serious philosophical weakness. But what I'd like to do, what Sarah Harris does that I think is, that I'd like to talk to you about, is he uses neuroscience. And he makes two big arguments. One, he uses the studies of Benjamin Libet talking about readiness potential, and that, in fact, our brains decide before we do. And then he talks about kind of random thoughts, all these random thoughts. And so we have all these thoughts coming through our minds. So let's first talk about the Benjamin Libet study. Can you explain what is the Benjamin Libet study, and what do you think Sam Harris gets wrong about it or misrepresents about it?
Sure. Libet was a neuroscientist who worked in the middle and late 20th century. And he was, I think, one of the great neuroscientists. I think he should have won the Nobel Prize. He didn't, but he was an extraordinary neuroscientist. And his fascination, really almost obsession, was with the correlation between brain activity and mental activity as a function of time. He was very interested in when you're thinking of something and your brain is doing something, how do they correspond in time? And it's a very important question. We obviously know we think of things constantly, and we know that our brain is doing things constantly. And at any moment in time, how do those line up? And so, in fact, his book, written for the popular press about his research, was called Mind Time. He did many different studies and many different projects, and frankly, they're all fascinating. His most famous one had to do with the question of free will. What he did is he took normal volunteers and he put electrodes on their scalp so he could record electrical activity in their brain continuously. He then made an oscilloscope. This was back in the mid-20th century, a little scope with a screen that had a sweep hand on it. And by glancing at the scope, you could tell what time it was to within like 10 milliseconds. So you could be fairly accurate as to what moment of time you were thinking of just by looking at what was happening on the scope. He then took a button and put it on a desk that you could press. And when you press the button, it would mark on the scope the moment you press the button. And also the brain waves that he was recording from the electrodes could be marked on the scope too. So he could line up what's happening in your brain when you think of something and when you do something like push a button in time. You could correlate them all. So he told the volunteers, he said, just sit at the desk, think about what you want, and then at some point decide that you want to push the button, and then immediately push the button as soon as you decide to do it. And let's see what's going on in your brain. And what he wanted the volunteers to do is when they decided to push the button, glance at the oscilloscope and tell me exactly the time that the thought to push the button, the decision, came into your head. So people would sit and do this, and they do it all day. He had hundreds and thousands of different trial runs on this. And what he found was quite consistently that when people would think, I'm going to push the button right now, about a half, maybe a little more of a second before they consciously were aware of the decision to push the button, there was a spike in brain activity in an area called the premotor area, usually on the contralateral side of their brain to the hand they were using to push the button. And this spike actually had been seen by previous researchers. It was known for several decades, and it was called the readiness potential, although Libet was the first person to study it in this fashion. And what Libet found was that every time somebody decided to push a button, that there was an unconscious readiness potential in the brain that corresponded to that decision that happened before they were consciously aware of the decision. And then, half a second later, they'd push the button. So the initial interpretation of that would be that you really didn't decide to push the button. Your brain had activity that made you push the button, but you didn't have any free will in it because your brain was driving it, this electrochemical brain process. But Libet wanted to look at that question in a little more depth. So what he did was he asked the volunteers, sit there, and I want you sometimes to decide to push the button and push it. Other times, I want you to decide to push the button, and then immediately after you decide to push it, veto your decision. Say, I don't think I'll do that. So, and kind of mix it up. Sit there, sometimes push it, sometimes decide to push it, but then don't push it. And what he found was that all of those results were exactly the same. That is, if you push the button or you didn't push the button, you always had the readiness potential, like a half second before you were aware consciously of your decision to push the button. But then whether or not you pushed the button didn't have any readiness potential. So he thought that was where free will was. It wasn't so much in the initial decision to push the button. It is in whether you actually went ahead with it or you vetoed it. And so he said that he felt like he didn't demonstrate the existence of free will so much as he demonstrated the existence of free won't. He demonstrated the existence of an ability to veto a motive, or perhaps to comply with a motive that had no brain activity associated with it. It was kind of immaterial. And he thought that was the free part.
Okay, so let me first get to clarify this. So there's a readiness potential when the person is asked to push the button, and right before they decide to push the button, they look when they decide, and then they push the button. But before they decide, there's a brain spike.
Correct.
And that brain spike is for lack of a better term, that's the readiness potential. So the argument that people like Sam Harris and others make is, well, actually you think you're free, but you already, your brain, again, this is the neurological fallacy, but we're going with it. The brain has already decided before you think you decided. So you think you're free, but you're already seeing a spike that's making you decide, right? And so that's the first. But then the second thing and Libet, there's maybe he says maybe so, maybe not. But there's a whole other part of the study that he says, well, if you decide not to push it, there's no readiness potential spike when you decide not to do something.
Right.
So that there's maybe free will, maybe not be free will. We can keep going on that, but there maybe not be free will, but it seems like there's free won't. So that you're correct. Right. So that's okay. So that's the summary. Now
you could even extend that reasoning. It's not only free won't. It's the idea that the decision to proceed with what came into your mind, either in a positive or negative sense, is electrically silent in the brain. That is, there's no physical correlate for it in the brain. And that immaterial aspect of it is what Libet attributed free will to.
Okay. So there's a couple of things that I have questions about. So first of all, it seems, this is, maybe you can explain this, but even the readiness potential, the person, the patient, whatever you want to call it, the person, the experimentee, was told, I want you to push this button. So in a sense, there's already this idea that they're going to push the button. Does that matter? Does that shape the way the discussion or the experiment is done, or is that irrelevant?
There are a couple issues here. which has been there's been an extensive discussion about this in the neuroscience community as well as the philosophical community. And actually, that's one reason I think that Libet didn't win the Nobel Prize, was that his ideas are so subtle and complex and frankly beautiful that nobody knew what to make of them. So they couldn't give him a prize if they didn't really understand it. The first question is, how realistic is that experimental setup in understanding human motivation, free will, morality, things like that? And of course, it's a very artificial setup. And that's not how decision-making generally works in the real world. It's a much more complex, interconnected process. And Libet knew that. He was a very smart man, and he knew that, but he had to reduce it to a very simple process to study it objectively. You have to break it down to its basic parts. First of all, the idea that everything we do is conscious to begin with is a profound misunderstanding of neuroscience. It is that the vast majority of what we do is done without our awareness. The simple act of walking across a room involves the coordination of many, many muscles, very subtle reflex patterns, all sorts of things that we're completely unaware of as we're doing it. So that it's not surprising that there would be brain activity that would occur without our awareness. There is all the time. All sorts of things are, and it's not just our breathing and our heart rate. It's coordination of muscles. So the vast majority of our behavior is not something for which we are consciously aware. That doesn't mean that we're not free and we don't choose. It just means that it's a much more subtle system, and what comes into awareness is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot else going on.
Ian McGilchrist makes a point like that, by the way, something similar, where I'll see if I can find the quote, but he basically says, why do we think that this small conscious awareness part of our brain is who we are? Maybe we're bigger than that. Maybe that more ourselves. I mean, this is a very much of a paraphrase, but that it's a reduction of ourself, the human being, the human person, to one aspect of our brain. But he says, if 80%, 90% of what our brain is doing is not with conscious awareness, maybe he said the problem is not that we don't have, that we are conscious, is that we have actually a limited understanding of what our self is. Maybe we have to expand our concept of what the self is beyond just a small element of conscious awareness. What do you make of that?
Yes, absolutely. And I actually think that because I'm a tremendous fan of the classical philosophers, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and they actually said it in a way that I think is closer to the truth than anything we've said in modern times. And what Aristotle said was that in our mind, there are the forms of things that we perceive and the forms of things that we understand. And he called that intelligible species or sensible species. But at the same time, there are perceptions and intellections and things like that are that by which we perceive. That is, that our mind has two components of sorts. There's the thing that we know, and there is the thing by which we know it. And the by which part is something that we are not aware of. For an example would be when I'm looking at a tree, I'm actually looking at the tree itself, and what I'm aware of is the tree. The perception of the tree, in modern terms, would be said to be the neurophysiological mechanisms by which I become aware of the tree, by which I see the tree. In the same way, if I'm thinking of a mathematical equation, my intellectual process of thinking of the equation is that by which I think of the equation. So the equation is the object, but there is a process by which I am able to think of that object. And in modern terms, I think the unconscious, what we think of as the unconscious, corresponds to the Aristotelian or Thomistic concept of by which. That is, the unconscious is that by which we understand the world. But we don't understand the unconscious itself in a direct fashion. It's the means of thought. It's not the end of thought.
So I found that McGilchrist's quote, actually, which really, he said, related to this Benjamin Libet study and other interpretations, he said, quote, this is from McGilchrist, quote, "But as one of the contributors to this debate points out, this is only a problem if one imagines that for me to decide something, I have to have willed it with the conscious part of my mind.
Right.
Perhaps my unconscious is every bit as much of me. In fact, he says, it better be, because so little of life is conscious at all." McGilchrist also says, "Why should we," end quotes, "not be our unconscious as well as our conscious selves?"
Absolutely.
Libet's experiment does not tell us that we do not choose to initiate action. It just tells us that we have to widen our concept of who we are to include our unconscious selves. So I think that's I think one interesting way of putting it. I want to make show you another critique of this, which is by Bennett and Hacker in their book, The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, that we've talked about before, and that you recommended to me, which I'm very grateful for. It's a fantastic book. But they actually critique the Libet study, and they say there's a couple of problems with it. One of the things they say at the end, they said, look, the feeling, he says, equally, this is a quote from Bennett Hacker, when asked to note when they feel an urge to move, the participant, they come up with such a feeling, even though moving one's hand voluntarily does not require and does not normally involve such a feeling. So the feeling, they say, the feeling reported is not what makes their movement voluntary, and any absence of feeling would not make it involuntary.
Right.
The fact, and this, I think this is the kind of a key line here, the fact that the neurons in the supplementary motor cortex fire 350 milliseconds before the feeling is allegedly apprehended does not show that the brain, quote, unconsciously decided to move before the agent did. It merely shows that the neuronal processes that activate the muscles began before the time at which the agent reported feeling a desire or feeling an urge to move to have occurred. But to repeat, voluntary movement is not a movement caused by a felt urge, any more than to refrain from voluntarily moving is to feel an urge not to move, which prevents one from moving. So there's a couple of things there. But number one, the point is, it doesn't show us that there's no free will. It just says that the processes of activate the muscles began before reporting the feeling. But they also point out that there's some conceptual ways that it was mistaken, and that's confusing what an urge is, right? And also confusing what voluntary and involuntary movements are. So for example, we feel urges to sneeze, and if we do sneeze, it's not a voluntary action, even though we had an urge, right? So they're kind of saying that the whole setup is a little bit erroneous.
Right.
What do you make of those critiques?
I think it's right on target. I think it's exactly true. And I point out in Libet's defense that I think he was very much aware of this and argued against the materialist and free will denialist perspective. He was a strong believer in free will, and he reduced this process of making decisions to such an artificially simple task. Because that was the only way that he could study it. But there's much more to it. The other thing is, I think that this actually dovetails very nicely with another beautiful aspect of Aristotelian philosophy, in which Aristotle felt that the process of becoming virtuous, as a part of his virtue ethics, the process of becoming virtuous was to make virtue a habit. I think most people who thought about issues like that deeply have come to the same conclusion, that the way you become virtuous, or the way you establish any kind of pattern of behavior over a long period of time, is you make it a habit. So you don't have to think about it all the time. It's just what you do. And in that sense, you're training this unconscious process in your brain to reset your perspective on things and to make you kind of automatically do things the way that you consciously would like to do them. So I think neuroscience looks at this whole process in much too much of a reductive sense. They sort of break it down into this unconscious and conscious. And the reality of a human being is that we are an essential whole. That there's a unity to us. And we are, a mixture of things we are aware of and things that we're not aware of. but we can change the things we're not aware of by gaining awareness and developing a habit. Libet actually felt that what he was seeing in his research was the idea that there were these preconscious readiness potentials in the brain that seemed to precede overt conscious decisions to do things. He saw them almost like temptations. And he felt that it was very much a validation of the traditional Christian way of understanding temptation and sin. He said that we are beset with what he called a sea of volibilities. There's a whole bunch of different motives that we didn't consciously generate. These kind of come upon us, and we all have that experience. He said, but we retain the libertarian freedom to accept them or reject them. And so he said that really he felt his research strongly supported the viewpoint that we have free will, and actually buttressed the traditional Christian understanding of temptation and sin.
Did he go so far as to actually say that, the traditional Christian understanding of sin?
Well, Judeo-Christian. I think he was Jewish, so Judeo-Christian. Yes. Okay, so he was quite explicit about that.
Okay, that's interesting. So that leads to the second part, really, of Sam Harris's argument, which is kind of interesting that you said that. So it seems to me, let me say this first. It seems to me, maybe this is unfair, but when I listen to Sam Harris, and I haven't heard every single thing he said on Libet, so feel free. I'm happy to be corrected, but at least parts that I've heard is that he abuses this study. He doesn't talk about free won't. He doesn't talk about Libet's conclusions. He kind of uses this as a weapon against free will. So I think that's an interesting point that, and I think it's just worth thinking about for a minute, because one of the things that is a problem I think that we're facing now with the kind of neuroscience arguments is that most people don't know neuroscience, and most people aren't philosophers. And so they have a general sense like, well, I'm responsible for my actions. I had an urge to do something. I sensed it was the wrong thing to do. I made a decision not to do that, or I did it and then I felt guilty about it, and I'm responsible. There's a general sense. But then, we have a little bit of an idolatry of science right now. And so you have, this, neuroscientist comes out and says, well, Benjamin Libet studies explain that we don't have any free will. And so it's almost like, I don't know about that, but I guess we don't, but who knows? And I think it's just even what the thing that I think we need to be clear about is even the studies themselves, there are problems, conceptual entanglements with the studies themselves, but there's even the evidence of the science doesn't somehow prove the conclusion that, say, Sam Harris gets from it. And so he's a materialist who has a preconceived notion that we don't have free will, and then uses the Benjamin Libet study to affirm that, but that's not what the study showed. And so it may not show, for example, that the Jewish Christian understandings of freedom are correct either, but it surely does not show, it seems to me, that materialism and the lack of free will has been proved by the Benjamin Libet studies. In some, do you think that's fair?
Yes. I think that's it. That's exactly right.
Okay.
One of my favorite quotes is from David Mamet, who's a playwright.
Oh, right. You said that last time. Yeah.
And what he said it in relation to politics, but it can be applied, I think, very, very nicely to materialism. Is that in order to advance a materialist agenda, materialists have to pretend not to know things. And this is a cardinal example of that. To say what Harris says about Libet's research would be acceptable only for a layperson who really didn't know anything about Libet's research and was just skimming it. For a neuroscientist to say what Harris says, or for a philosopher to say what Harris says, means that he is deliberately pretending not to know, because this is the cornerstone of Libet's work. Was his free won't, was his affirmation of free won't, his affirmation of free will, so that again, a professional who gets up in front of people and says that Libet's work supported the notion that free will doesn't exist is a lie. Okay, it's just a lie.
And we could be charitable. Maybe his preconceived materialism made him ignore the thing. We'll be charitable.
No,
but it seems false.
No. I couldn't disagree. I could not disagree more. The first thing we've disagreed on. There was no reason. There was no reason for charity. None. This is an extraordinarily intelligent man. Harris is a bright guy who has a PhD in neuroscience, who publicly claims to have profound insight into basic philosophical and metaphysical truths about humanity, who has published more books than practically anybody on the modern scene, who's made a great deal of money off publishing those books and has become famous, who is misrepresenting the most fundamental aspect of a very important part of research. It is a lie. It is not a misunderstanding. Harris is smart enough to know this. Okay, all you have to do is, frankly, skim over Libet's book, Mind Time. You don't have to read his detailed papers, although it's in his detailed papers. You just skim the popular press, and you find out that Libet said that he proved free will. To not mention that is to lie. If you're a neuroscientist or a philosopher. If a layman didn't pick up on that, hey, maybe he didn't have a good day. Harris has been at this for years, and it's just a lie. And he deserves he doesn't earn a pass on this.
Okay, well, I mean, it's definitely propaganda. So I find a lot of his work propaganda. So let's go to his second part of his work, because you brought it up, and I think it connects to Libet's point about temptation. So a second part of Harris's argument against free will is that we have many thoughts coming to our minds all the time, right? He says these are random thoughts that we have no control over, right? And so these are thoughts that affect us. They press themselves upon us. Is one way that, say, Dietrich von Hildebrand kind of has this image. And he says that these random thoughts, that is another manifestation that we don't really have free will. So now I found this, just like I found when I first heard Harris, I didn't know the Libet studies, right? I didn't know what the free won't element. But I already mentioned the first part. I thought, well, wait, why are you spending all this time trying to convince me to change my mind? It's an incoherent position. But the other thought I thought was very interesting is that he would derive this idea that we have these thoughts coming through our mind as a proof that we don't have free will. Now, and the reason I say this, there's many, but here's one. This is not a new problem, right? On the human side, on the scientific side, or the psychological, spiritual levels. I mean, there's a lot of traditional and current reflection on this matter, okay? And I thought you bringing up Libet saying this is the idea of Jewish-Christian idea of temptation. I mean, this is a classic element of Jewish and, say, especially Catholic thought and Orthodox thought since the beginning, right? We have all these thoughts and desires. Mm-hmm. Some are random, some are seemingly random, right? They may not be exactly random, but they're seemingly random, and they're going through our minds all the time. And that the idea and the tradition is that we have to capture those thoughts, and we have to choose the good and avoid the evil. So Aquinas, for example, I think I might have talked about this last time, speaks about how we're embodied persons, right? Everything comes through our senses, right? Or at least we apprehend all these things through our senses much more than we're cognitively aware of, right? And so we're seeing all these things, like we're walking through the day and we're seeing all these images. Maybe it doesn't register. Well, later it comes out, right? And so it's not necessarily random. I passed a billboard that had a picture, say a sensual picture that I didn't notice, but I picked it up, and then that comes out later. And then that sensual image comes in, and I have to say, oh, am I gonna dwell upon this, or I'm gonna make a decision to say, no, it's not the right thing to do, and put it out of my mind, right? So this is one element. And then the other I think interesting thing is in the Eastern tradition of like, or Eastern Orthodoxy, but also part of the West, there's the idea, there's this concept called the logismi, right? The little thoughts. And you see this in Catholic and Orthodox psychology and spiritual training. You see it in like John of the Cross, that we're going to get these thoughts come in, right? And from, let's use classical Christian language, from the world, the flesh, and the devil. So we have temptations all the time, right? We have desires, inordinate desires. We have violent thoughts or sexual thoughts or malicious thoughts or envious thoughts. And we're, in a sense, being bombarded by them. And so Sam Harris is right. We're sitting there listening to a Sam Harris lecture, and all of a sudden we have this violent thought, right? I mean, St. John of the Cross writes about this. While you're in church, you will sometimes have these violent, sensual thoughts. And he says, okay, so what do? Well, you pause, you make an act of the will, you capture the thought, you decide that I'm not going to act upon it, dwell upon it, think about it, and you push it out of your mind. Dietrich von Hildebrand, the 20th century philosopher, says that we have an emotion rising up in us, and if it's a good emotion, then we affirm it with the will. We say it's the right thing, when we affirm it. So we're moved by the beauty of a landscape or whatever it might be, and then we affirm it. Or we have a negative emotion, like a desire, say lust, for example, and it presses itself upon us. But we make this act of the will, and what von Hildebrand says, we decapitate the emotion. So we accept it. We say, okay, I'm having this desire. It's an unreasonable desire. Say, we'll take lust, for example. Why is lust unreasonable? Because it's an irrational act to treat a subject, person with hopes, wants, fears, dreams, who's an individual subject and not a thing. It's irrational to treat them like a thing. And when we objectify that person, it's wrong. So it's a sin. So when that desire comes up for that, we decapitate it. We say no, and we instead see them as a person and turn our eyes and move on to the next thing. Well, this is classic part of kind of Christian psychology, Jewish psychology for centuries, for millennia. Mm-hmm. And Harris concludes, we have random thoughts come in, therefore we don't have any free will. I mean, it seems, in fact, to prove the very opposite, that among all these thousands of random thoughts, we can actually choose to act in a certain way. And as you allude to Aristotle, we can build habits of good that build a character that create, in a sense, a whole attitude or background to the way we engage life and other people. I mean, it seems like Sam Harris not only misread the Libet conclusion study, but he kind of misunderstood a fundamental human experience. What do you say to that?
Oh, yes. It just, again, buttresses Mamet's principle that in order to be a materialist, you have to pretend not to know things. And it turns out he has to pretend not to know not only neuroscience, but philosophy and Western history and the history of Christianity and Judaism and so on. So ultimately, you kind of come to the conclusion that there's a lot of stuff that you have to pretend not to know to hold to those kind of materialist viewpoints because it's just absurd. A very interesting question, almost a devilishly difficult question, is what do we even mean by free will? That is, what is free will? Even to deny free will, you have to give a coherent definition of what it is. And I think the best framework to understand what is meant by free will, because it gets to issues like, for example, do animals have free will? You know, does my dog, when he wants to eat a dog treat, does he have free will to decide whether to eat it or not? And I think the best framework to understand free will is the hylomorphic framework. And Aristotle said that in order to provide a complete explanation for a particular state of affairs, you have to describe what are now called the four causes for that state of affairs. And every state of affairs has a material cause, it has an efficient cause, it has a formal cause, and it has a final cause. Material cause is basically just the matter or the stuff that constitutes that thing. The classic example is a statue. The material cause of a marble statue of David would be the marble. The efficient cause would be Michelangelo chipping away at it, the thing that whose action led to it. The formal cause would be the idea in Michelangelo's head of what David looked like. So the form would be three-dimensional David. And the final cause is the purpose for which it was made, because he wanted to make something beautiful, he wanted to sell a statue, whatever his purposes were. And when you understand all of those causes, Aristotle would say, then you understand the statue, you understand what it's all about. You can apply the same four causes to neuroscience. In fact, I think that neuroscience is best understood under the rubric of the four causes. You can say, let's say that I decide to write a letter to my wife. And well, let's see, the material cause of that decision would be brain processes going on, neurotransmitters, action potentials, things happening. The material cause would be the brain matter, would be the brain tissue and things like that. The efficient cause would be the various physiological things going on, the action potentials and all the dynamics that take place that make me write the letter. The formal cause is my intellectual decision to write the letter and the intellectual content of the letter, telling my wife about what I'm doing today and things like that. And the final cause would be my will, that is the actual decision to write it, to take that idea and to put it on paper and write it out. So that every human action has a material cause, has an efficient cause, has a formal cause and a final cause. Neuroanatomists study the material cause. That is, they study the structure of neurons. Neurophysiologists would study the efficient cause, the action potentials and things like that. A philosopher would study the formal cause, the intellectual content of what's in the letter. And perhaps an ethicist would study the final cause, my purposes for writing the letter, my intentions, and so on. So that every human action has all these causes. And neuroscience properly can restrict itself to material and efficient causes. There's nothing wrong with that. But neuroscience hasn't addressed the formal and final cause, which is the intellect and will, which is not in their bailiwick. Now, when you look at animals, animals don't have intellects and will. Animals have purely material processes. So my dog does not have free will. He decides to do things and he does them. But it's not free will in the sense of an immaterial will, not the same as human beings have. But human beings are unique in having free will. And that gets back to what I said before, that to deny free will is to deny our humanity. It's to reduce us to animals. It's also politically extremely dangerous to deny free will.
Right. And I think that's I think another just element of weakness, that no society can function without an understanding of free will. I mean, our entire Western judicial system is rooted on the fact that people have responsibility and culpability gets decreased or increased, and depending on the situation. I mean, the whole structure of how we think about justice is grounded in free will. But I think it seems to me, like using that Aristotelian, four causes, that it seems, and like as I listen to you and I think about it, that it's not simply that neuroscience can work on the material and the efficient cause, but that in fact, and I think Bennett and Hacker do a really good job in articulating this, but there's so many conceptual errors that in fact, because they have errors about formal, and let me put it in my term using Aristotle, right? Because they have, I'm not saying Bennett and Hacker would say this. They don't agree with this, but let me just kind of follow on you, saying that because there are so many misconceptions, conceptual entanglements, incoherencies around, and then preconceived materialism around these issues of formal and final cause, that they're fundamentally rejected, that it actually distorts the practice of neuroscience in the efficient and material realm. That is, that our questions, and you mentioned this in our last talk, that the questions that we ask, that because we have preconceived materialism, or that at least that's the dominant way, we end up asking all of these questions or doing these studies that are, in a sense, misdirected. They're not sufficient. And I can give you some examples from Bennett and Hacker on that, especially in the area of consciousness. But that seems to be that it's not simply that neurosciences ignore the final and the formal causes, but that the erroneous judgments about the formal and final causes, in fact, distorts their work on the efficient and the material. What do you think?
Absolutely true. I think a basic principle of science is that you must first get the question right before the answer that you get from your experiment has any genuine meaning. And if you get the question wrong, then you can't get the right answer. And materialists invariably get the questions wrong.
Here's an example of this. I'll have to shorten it a bit, but it's in chapter 9 of Bennett and Hacker's book on consciousness, the intransitive and transitive consciousness, and they kind of start their discussion about consciousness in the brain. And again, this is a quick summary, but that the dominant neuroscientists will say that consciousness. Here's a quote from Edelman and Tononi. Quote, consciousness arises as a particular kind of brain process. It's a, quote, a special kind of physical process that arises in the structure and dynamics of certain brains. Michael Gazzaniga says it's, quote, a property of a neural network. They quote a number of philosophers. And they say this is the great mystery, right? We don't understand consciousness. It's the wonderful. It's not the wonderful. It's the great. It's the fascinating quote. This is Stuart Sutherland quote. It's a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It's impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. And then they say, well, there's a couple reasons for that. And people like Daniel Dennett say, well, it's really a question of privacy. Same with Antonio Damasio. Edelman say, well, it's really privacy. You only experience consciousness yourself. And so Mike Egnor's consciousness and Michael Matheson Miller's consciousness are so private that we can't possibly know or have a discussion about it. And this is what Bennett and Hacker say. They said that these are fundamentally confused elements, and that we've made some mistakes and we've confused ignorance and mystery. So one of the things you'll hear a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers say, oh, consciousness is completely mysterious. It's mysterious. And they say this, quote, ignorance is one thing, mystery another. Not only do scientists and philosophers confess to lamentable ignorance, they also commonly allege that consciousness is profoundly, quote, mysterious. Okay? Crick and Koch, for example, remark that consciousness is, quote, the most mysterious aspect of the mind-brain problem. Other people agree, and they list a number of people, this whole idea of mystery, 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 mystery. And then they write, one should be wary when told that something is a deep mystery. There are many subjects about which scientists are ignorant and many empirical questions to which they don't know the answers. There are some subjects about which they are not merely ignorant, but do not have any clear idea and perhaps not even a vague idea of how to answer the questions that baffle them. So they say, they continue, these subjects and questions may be dignified by the name mysteries, although to be sure, one should be careful not to confuse such mysteries, that is, forms of ignorance, with what is wonderful or awesome. So there's a lot of wonderful things, great works of art, beautiful landscapes, etc. But the wonder has nothing to do with ignorance. We're not ignorant of these things. And so what they continue and they say that we have to be careful not to confuse forms of puzzlement about nature, which are consequent on our ignorance, with mystifications consequent upon conceptual entanglement. And that too often we say something's mysterious because actually our conceptual framework is wrong, right? And so we have to, then I'll conclude this part, that conceptual confusion is not the same as error of fact. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. An error of fact is a false belief, but conceptual confusion involves incoherence. So he said, for example, Kepler had an error of fact to think there were only 5 planets, or Descartes that it was the pineal gland in the brain which signals from the 2 eyes or the 2 ears that brought the brain together. Okay, he says, but, and this is important, it is a conceptual confusion to suppose that the mind is a kind of entity, either immaterial like Descartes thought, or the brain, as many suppose today, or that the brain thinks, perceives, or calculates, as many neuroscientists suppose, or that self-consciousness is consciousness of a self or an I. Conceptual confusion consists in transgressing the bounds of sense, and the result of transgressing the bounds of sense is nonsense. That is, a form of words which has no sense. And here I think they lined up a little bit with Aquinas, who also says, can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Right. Well, it's nonsense. It's right. Can you make a square circle? It's nonsense. It's transgressed the bounds of conceptual clarity. It seems to me that's a huge problem for neuroscience, and that it's actually negatively affecting the studies. But again, I'm an outsider, so I would like to know what you think as a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist.
Well, I think that conceptual confusion is the cornerstone of modern neuroscience. I mean, it's just a mess. And as Roger Scruton famously said, that he referred to a particular aspect of neuroscience, but can be applied more broadly, that neuroscience is a vast trove of answers with no memory of the questions. That basically neuroscientists are just churning out all kinds of, perfectly valid descriptions of what neurons do and so on. But the interpretation of that science is completely nonsensical as regards the mind, because the metaphysical predicates from which they're working, which is generally materialism, is nonsensical. So yeah, it's a complete mess. And again, the disturbing thing is that while one doesn't expect necessarily a neuroscientist to be an Aristotelian philosopher, the reality is that the fact that it's a conceptual mess is pretty obvious to anybody who is willing to look at it objectively. And neuroscientists are many of them are quite resistant to looking at things this way. I've had colleagues at the university who are neuroscientists with whom I discuss this, and I'll say, how is it that you attribute vision to a part of the brain? The brain itself can't see things, and the people see things, but the brain doesn't see things. And the neuroscientists, one in particular, would just say, "Oh yes, of course the neurons see things. That's the only way it can happen." So they're just philosophically innocent of the real issues going on. And when you're dealing with really intelligent people, as these scientists are, who are unwilling to examine even basic philosophical concepts, to some degree, it's deliberate on their part. They really don't want to look at these issues. They have to they pretend not to know them.
I'm still going to be charitable. Maybe I won't get castigated like with Sam Harris, but I think my charitable reading is, I think that's partially true. I do think that's true. I think the other way to think about this is that, in a sense, their deliberateness is because their materialist preconceptions, their worldview, is incoherent on its own terms. But it also comes with a lot of things going around it. In fact, I have a conversation on this podcast with Jay Richards about materialism, and there's I think we need to talk more about it. But I do think, I think sometimes it ends up becoming a parallel to what Dietrich von Hildebrand called value blindness. I think there's just an intellectual blindness, and the fact is, it's affirmed by everybody. So you're this kind of strange person who comes in as a gadfly and says, "Well, wait, hold on a minute," but it's all their colleagues affirm, no, it's just the neurons see. And so it's this, I do agree with you, it's deliberate, but it's also like a contagion of the mereological fallacy is just accepted. And so to challenge it requires so much work, and also undermining of someone's work career. Like, well, I mean, not necessarily, but saying, wait a minute, the last 20 years I've been doing this work and it's based on false assumptions. Well, yes, and I think this is the point, and then I want to move on to a couple of studies, but I think this is a point that you made that's important. It's not that neuroscience is bad. It's not that we're not learning very interesting things about the brain, about neurons, about vision, and I want to talk about those just in a second, some of those very interesting things, but that the problem is the conclusions, and it's like the abuse of the studies of people like Sam Harris, or the preconceived materialist framework that makes you conclude something that if you didn't have that kind of constricted framework, it's almost obvious that the answer to that is not. It might not be, like I said, it might not be Orthodox Judaism or Orthodox Catholicism, but it's clearly not materialism, and that's for sure, right? And I think there's just this. It's the deep kind of ideological materialism shapes science so much that, yes, maybe it's deliberate, but I think it's also just incredible contagion that people are trapped in what I call a hall of mirrors of materialism, and they just can't get out.
Yeah, but you have to realize that this kind of contagion that you're describing, and which is sort of a Girardian perspective, which I also hold. Mm-hmm. I think that's a deep insight. This kind of contagion is not a viral contagion, meaning that we are not passive, innocent victims of some little pocket of protein and DNA.
True.
That this contagion is driven by motivation, and the motivation for these neuroscientists is that you become one of the crowd, you get invited to the right parties, you get tenure, you get grants if you play the game, if you talk like they talk. If you stand up at a national meeting in neuroscience and declare that dualism is a much more insightful way to understand neuroscience, you will be laughed at. You probably will lose grants because of that. And your career will be in jeopardy. The neuroscientist who says things like that gets himself in a lot of trouble. So the motivations here are not admirable, right? These are cowardly decisions made by people who don't want to buck the system, because they won't go as far in their careers if they buck the system. So these motivations are not innocent. Going along with materialism is a culpable error. And a really good scientist, and frankly, the great scientists, have been people who were willing to kind of stand up in the middle of the river and say, I don't like the way the stream is going. The truth is elsewhere. So these people are betraying moral standards and betraying scientific standards by adhering to materialism.
I do agree with you. It's a culpable error. I mean, I think it actually points to another kind of Thomistic Aristotelian point that intellectual errors are vices.
Yeah,
it's a vice.
Absolutely.
And we all have intellectual errors. We all have the blindness. But I think, and so, yes, I'm trying to be charitable in the readings of it, and I think there's contagion. But I do think you're right. I mean, there's definitely culpable intellectual error that is willful. There's a willful ignorance and a blindness that exists. And I think this is. I think that's why. But it's interesting. This is why, one of the reasons I want to talk to you about this is because I think a lot of people, when they hear the scientific studies, they're like, "Oh, okay, well, I guess all the evidence is pointing against the traditional ways of thinking." I mean, I hear people say, our ancestors, they thought that we were, the spiritual kind of special being, but now we just know now that we're just code. We're just information. I'm like, okay, well, why is that different from being a cell, right? It falls prey to the mereological fallacy, but it also falls prey to just kind of false scientism. So let me actually shift here before we end. I'd like you to talk about some studies you've mentioned before. One of them is, you mentioned dualism and different people coming up with different things. One is the studies of Penfield on epilepsy. And then also, I've mentioned this in another podcast I had with Jaron Lanier. I brought this up, but I've heard you talk about it. So I'd like you to maybe explain the Owen study on vegetative state and consciousness. But maybe let's start with the Penfield position, because I think that's an example of a very important neuroscientist who concluded materialism was false, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Wilder Penfield was one of the pioneers in neurosurgery. He worked in the mid-20th century. And he really is the father of epilepsy surgery. So he worked at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he was a superb scientist and superb neurosurgeon. And he
explain a little bit epilepsy surgery, just so
it is doing surgery on the brain to cure epilepsy. Generally, it involves the removal of a small region of the brain where the epileptic focus is starting, and this prevents the seizures. There are other ways of doing it, but that really was what Penfield did, and his research on it involved doing awake brain surgery. He would do,
and you've done that. Am I correct? You've done awake brain surgery.
Yes. It's not my specialty, but I have done it, and one of my colleagues does it regularly. And what it entails is the brain itself feels no pain, so you can cut the brain and it doesn't hurt. You can give local anesthesia, basically like Novocaine or lidocaine, to the scalp and to the areas of the head that would feel pain, so that the patient feels no pain as you're operating. In fact, what we usually do is that we put the patient to sleep, do the initial part of the surgery, give them adequate local anesthesia so they don't feel pain from the wound. And then when we're working on the brain, we wake them up. So they're awake while we're working on the brain. And then you can stimulate the brain, you can suppress it, you can kind of map it and find out what areas are critical and what areas you can work safely in to safely remove epileptic foci. So Penfield did, he was the first person to really do this on a large scale. And he did, I think, at least 1,000 patients like this. And he was a meticulous scientist and carefully mapped everything he learned about how the brain worked on these patients who were awake. And he started out his career as a materialist. He believed all the mind came from the brain, and he was all that. And he found two things in his career that radically changed his viewpoint. And he wrote a book about it. I think it's The Mystery of the Mind, I think is the name of the book. The two things he found was, first of all, he found that he could stimulate the surface of the brain, and it would make a person move something, like move an arm or move a leg, depending on where he stimulated. He could also ask them to move an arm or a leg, and they would do that. But they could always tell the difference as to whether he stimulated them to move the arm or leg or whether they did it on their own. That is, they always knew when they had willed it and when it was happening against their will. And no matter where Penfield stimulated in the brain, he could never get anyone to mistakenly attribute agency, for example, to themselves, when actually it was Penfield that made them move that limb. So Penfield said that there was an aspect of free will that was beyond the material brain because he couldn't find it. He stimulated everywhere. And at nowhere could he make someone have this free will to move something. They always knew that if they did move something and Penfield had done it, they always knew the truth. Penfield did it, not them. The other thing that he found, which I think is an absolutely fascinating observation, that is, it's so obvious, at least to doctors who treat seizures, that we overlook it because it's right in front of us. And it is that Penfield asked rhetorically, why are there no intellectual seizures? The kinds of things that people do during a seizure, it's called the ictus, they're enormously different kinds of seizures. Some seizures, you completely go unconscious and fall on the ground. Some seizures, you'll twitch a finger or twitch an arm or twitch your face or twitch your foot. Some seizures cause an emotional change. There are people who have seizures that involve fear or anger. Some people have sensory things where they'll feel a tingling or they'll see a flash of light. And some people have memories where a seizure will actually evoke a memory of a specific thing. But what Penfield noticed was that there were no seizures that evoked abstract thought. That, for example, there are no calculus seizures. Nobody ever has a seizure and starts doing differential equations. There are no morality seizures where you have a seizure and you start thinking about how terrible the Holocaust was. There are no seizures that involve abstract thought. And he said, wow, that's weird. Because if the brain gives rise to abstract thought in the same way that it gives rise to movement and sensation and memories and things like that, then we would expect, once in a while a seizure would, make us do addition or subtraction. But it never, ever does. And I've never seen an intellectual seizure. Penfield never saw one. There's never been one that I'm aware of that's ever been reported in the literature. There is a rare kind of seizure called forced thinking seizures, which some people have claimed are intellectual seizures. But when you look carefully, they're not. What forced thinking seizures are really is emotional seizures that stimulate a particular line of thought, but the seizure itself, the ictus, is the emotion. People will feel an intense desire to think about something. But
can you explain that a little bit? How is that? So how is that emotional seizure different from?
Let's say that when I think about doing calculus, it reminds me of the affection I had for my high school math teacher, who I thought was a great guy. It was really, really fascinating. I just loved the guy. And I loved being in his class, and I just was so happy. A forced thinking seizure would be kind of a reminiscence of that feeling that you had. And you'd go on to think about, yeah, right, that's when I took calculus. But the seizure is the emotion. It's not the thinking. The seizure is the emotional milieu. And the thinking is not the seizure itself. So forced thinking seizures, a very common kind of forced thinking seizure, these are rare seizures, would be a fear. A person would get this intense fear. And if this person had a particular fear of strangers breaking into the house at night, the person would wake up at night with this intense fear. And they would think about maybe there's somebody breaking into the house. But when you look carefully at what the seizure is the fear. It's not the thought that comes as a consequence of the fear. So it's still an emotion.
And so fear, ask maybe this is too technical, but so like we talked in the last episode about Joseph Ledoux's work on, say, danger versus fear.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's actually conceptual problem with that question of like no fear, no self, no fear. I mean, what is the self that's fearing? I think it's an error. But he makes the distinction that you can have cognitive. So I said the conclusion maybe I think is conceptually problematic, but let's postpone that for another time. You can have a sense of danger without being cognitively aware of it. So the amygdala are reacting to danger, but you don't. If you said, "Are you afraid of something?" You say, "No, I'm not afraid." What's happening in that forced thinking? Is that what it's called? Forced thinking seizure with emotion.
Again, the forced thinking seizures are very rare. There's not much written on them. But when you do look at the literature on forced thinking seizures, it clearly is not that people are forced to think of abstract things. What they generally are is it's kind of an obsessive compulsive kind of seizure, where the forced thinking is always of specific things, of specific emotional states. It's never abstract thought. Forced seizures don't make you think about doing a complex analysis using imaginary numbers or something. It's never abstract. It's always concrete. And
concrete. So and then what about, like, maybe there's not experience with this, but what about, so there's a philosophical category, people like C.S. Lewis or Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, Dietrich von Hildebrand, this idea of reasonable emotions. So love, mercy, compassion. So love is an act of the will that wills the good of the other. Is there any evidence of forced seizures? You said you gave the calculus example, like like a reminiscence of, oh, he was a great guy, and it makes you think of calculus. Is there any forced seizure of say spirit higher emotions that we know of, and how would those manifest?
Well, no, there's no forced seizure that I'm aware of. I certainly have never seen one do this, and I've looked at the literature and I couldn't find anything in the literature that would suggest this. There's no forced seizure that in which abstract thought is a part of the ictus, that is a part of the seizure itself. An example of the distinction between the seizure itself and abstract thought would be, let's say that you have a seizure that involves your right arm shaking uncontrollably in ways that you can't predict. So that, you're sitting there and all of a sudden your arm begins to shake. The shaking of the arm is the seizure. Now, you might think about this seizure as being something that is tragic in your life. And you might ask, well, why has God done this to me? And then you get off on this train of philosophical or theological reflection about your seizure. That might even happen at the same time as your seizure. That is, you're sitting there, your arm's shaking away, and you're thinking, God, why are you doing this to me? But those are two different things. That is, the seizure itself is the arm shaking. And you can have an abstract thought process in response to that. But the abstract thought is not the seizure. And when you look carefully at forced thinking seizures, any even hint of abstract content to them is a reflection on the seizure. It's not the seizure itself. So the seizure itself,
and even by the way, even the reflection, even that abstract thought is another really complex question.
Yes.
Even
yes, of course,
like that it would be, and even, I mean, so like even if there was, so the fact that the person can have abstract thought about the seizure is, I think, a whole other opens up a whole other layer of questions anyway that doesn't get solved. So let me, I know we're kind of going a little long here, but I think there's one other study I'd like you to talk about, which I think is really interesting. And it's the work of Owen. He's Canadian, I think also, on vegetative state. And some of the new, because I think this is another interesting thing. I mean, having to do with what does brain death look like, or what is a person what is the difference between brain and conscious? The brain is completely injured. And we're finding out that it's actually, again, more complex than we thought. Can you talk a little bit about the Owen study and explain that?
Sure.
And some of the consequences or implications? I mean, even if it's not a final implication, what does it seem to point to?
It's important first to clarify the terms. Brain death means the biological death of the brain, beginning at the top of the spinal cord up. And brain death is death, meaning legally it's considered the same thing as being dead. So, for example, people can donate organs when they're brain dead. And none of what we're talking about now has anything to do with brain death. That's a completely...
We're talking about vegetative state,
right?
Which is different.
Well, vegetative state is different. Vegetative state is a relatively recent diagnosis. It sort of became popular in the 1960s and 70s, and it is a very deep form of coma, in which the assumption is made that there is no mental content whatsoever. And you can kind of summarize it by saying that a person is an object but not a subject. There's no first-person experience of any nature. You have you don't feel pain, you don't feel emotions, you don't have any thoughts. You're just a biological organism without a mind, basically. It was believed, and I think it's a garbage diagnosis. I think it's bad medicine and for a whole bunch of reasons, and bad science. But the assumption was that by a clinical examination, doctor sits down at the bedside and examines a patient, that he could decide based on that examination that person no longer has any kind of mental content. And the assumption was somebody who had massive brain damage, and it would be called persistent vegetative. People who are in persistent vegetative state, they often appear to be awake. They'll look around. They have reflexes, if you pinch them, so they can move and so on. But they don't appear to have any behaviors that correlate with awareness of any sort. So the diagnosis, there are various criteria that have been used, and people have been diagnosed with it. And it's used largely as a way of prognosticating. Somebody has a bad brain injury. If they're at a certain minimal level of function a year or two later, you can then put the diagnosis of persistent vegetative state, and their relatives then can learn that they're really never going to improve. The question is, are people who are that badly brain damaged really without any mental content? Is that true? And the problem, of course, is that the only way we can assess the mental content of another person is through their behavior. That is, we can't read their minds. And the problem is somebody who has really bad brain damage has a behavioral impediment, because usually they're partially paralyzed. If they move, it's very crude kinds of movement because of the brain damage. So the very brain damage so the very brain activity that is necessary for us to know what's in another person's mind is precisely the brain activity that is compromised by the brain damage. So the more badly damaged they are, the less validity we can claim for our neurological exam, because we don't know what's going on because they've got so much motor injury too. So Adrienne Allen is a neuropsychologist at Cambridge in England, and he got an interesting idea. He took a woman, this was like in 2005, I believe, a woman who had persistent vegetative state. She was a young woman in her 30s who had been in a car accident and had been reliably diagnosed as being in persistent vegetative state. He put her in a functional MRI machine. A functional MRI machine is an MRI that reads changes in regional blood flow in the brain, and these changes seem to correlate with mental activity. So he put her in the MRI machine, and he asked her questions. He said, imagine that you're playing tennis. Imagine you're walking across the room. Think of things. And he looked at her functional MRI images, and he found that her brain, which was badly damaged, still lit up in certain areas on the functional MRI images, which was kind of interesting. And they lit up in response to his questions. So then he took 15 normal volunteers, and he put them in the MRI machine, and he asked them the same questions. And then he took the functional MRI images to radiological colleagues, and he said, pick out the person who's in persistent vegetative state based on this imaging. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't tell the difference between her response and the normal people. Her brain lit up in just the same way as the normal people's brains did. So that seemed to imply that she had mental states, and then that they're even normal. It's just that she couldn't communicate them. So then what he did, which was very, very clever, he said, well, we don't really know what's causing the lighting up of the brain on the functional MRI images. And perhaps it's not an awareness that's making it light up. Perhaps it's just like a reflex to the sound. Like the ears receive the sound, it causes neurons to fire, but you don't have to be home. So what he did was he took the same words he had asked her, the initial session, and he asked her again, but he scrambled the words so they didn't make any sense. So instead of asking, imagine you're walking across the room, he said, room, walking across, imagine. And he looked at what her brain did, and her brain did nothing. There was no response. And he did the normal volunteers, and they also had no response. So what he showed was that her brain activity, when asked these questions, when she's asked to think about things, was indistinguishable from normal people, and that activity disappeared when there was no semantic content to the sound. So she clearly was understanding what he was saying. And other people have repeated Owen's work, including Owen himself. And there have been, my guess, there's been upwards of at least 100 people studied so far in persistent vegetative state, and almost half of them show clear evidence of understanding what's going on around them. There are people who have massive brain damage who can do mathematics. That is, you can ask them using functional MRI imaging, what is the square root of 25? And when you can say, is it 6? Is it 4? Is it 5? And when you say 5, their brain lights up. So there are people who have massive brain damage who are diagnosed by ordinary means as having no mental function whatsoever, who by functional MRI imaging have a great deal of complex thought. And it's very, very, very exciting research.
I think there's a lot of things. One, I think it's just exciting. It's more, it shows the wonder and complexity of the human person. But I also think there's a philosophical element too. A lot of times we try to reduce, which I think is an error. We reduce personhood to consciousness, which I think is an arbitrary reduction. I think that we have to understand the person as a whole being, and not simply the person. Personhood doesn't come because you're conscious, or any other arbitrary element. But I think it shows that sometimes what we perceive to be lacking any mental capacity whatsoever, whether it's in an elderly person or a person with a vegetative state, or an unborn child, or other persons with disorders. In fact, we often are misled by a simplistic or a reductionist way of thinking. I think that's an interesting. I think it just further points to the complexity and of the human person. Tell me, do you see any other implications for that, or anything? Any other?
I think there are enormous implications in medical ethics, because quite honestly, and I don't mean to cast aspersion on some of my professional colleagues, but I think part of the motivation for diagnosing people in persistent vegetative state has been to kind of relegate them to being hopeless, to put them in a corner, to say, well, this person has no mental content, so we don't have to keep giving them therapy, we don't have to keep talking to them. And in the case of Terry Schiavo, this woman who was diagnosed in persistent vegetative state back about 20 years ago, we could even withdraw their feeding and let them starve to death, because if you have no mental content, what's the big deal? Why not just get it over with? So I think that there are some ethically disturbing motives behind labeling people with severe brain damage as being in persistent vegetative state. I think it's morally wrong as well as scientifically wrong. And that people who are in deep comas need to be treated with respect and affection. And frankly, a lot of the nursing staff and families, they kind of know this. I mean, I have patients who are supposedly in persistent vegetative state, and the families tell me, well, they obviously understand. They'll see that they'll mention something sad and the person gets a tear, or someone that they love walks into the room and their heart rate goes up. The families and the nurses who take care of them tell me all the time that this person's aware. It's just a different kind of awareness because of the brain damage. So we have to be careful about the ethical consequences of labeling people as having no minds, because it really denies their humanity.
That's right. I think that's important. I think that's one of the themes, of course, of this Moral Imagination podcast, and one of the things I'm most interested in is just what does it mean to be a human person? And we have to avoid reductionist concepts. And I think some of the work of Owen and the work on the vegetative state, I think further points that we need more modesty and humility, and also avoiding a type of scientism, but also just to have. This is where I think a deep, integrated understanding of the human person is so very important. Well, Dr. Egnor, thanks so much. I've taken a lot of your time. We've talked about a lot of things. There's a lot more we could discuss. I hope you will be willing to come back to the Moral Imagination podcast, and we can talk a lot more about philosophy of the person, neuroscience, medical ethics, and a host of other things. So I'm very grateful for you taking the time, and thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination podcast. Dr. Egnor, thanks again for joining the show.
Thank you, Michael.